The order.
That's good.
I'm following my missionary guide. I'm Jennifer March, if people don't remember who I am. And I think I need to remind you that the meeting is being filmed as required by local law. And before we get started, we're going to welcome two new advisory board members. Tony Shoras, as many of you know, served Mayor de Blasio's first deputy mayor during the first term, and prior to that held many leadership roles in the public sector, including executive director of the Port Authority. And you are filling, and you are now filling the slot of a nationally recognized budget expert. So, welcome, Tony. And Wayne Ho is the current head of the Chinese American Planning Council and has now joined the board. And he is holding the slot of an officer of a human service advocacy organization involved in budget matters, previously held by Nancy Waxstein. So welcome, Wayne. And I think we should go around and introduce ourselves.
Okay, Ronnie Lowenstein, IBO Director.
Deborah Golby, I'm the chair of a, my role is the chair of a economics department with a graduate program.
Yeah.
In the city.
In the city. Yes.
Well qualified.
Good morning, Mark Canizaro, Council of School Supervisors and Administrators, and my role is union leader.
Morning, I'm Finn Lacoste. My role is Dean of a Business School.
Lisa Neary, I'm the general counsel of IBO.
And Jennifer March from Citizens Committee for Children.
I want to know who all these are.
Jonathan Rosenberg from IBO. Doug Turetsky, Chief of Staff and Communications Director.
Taina Guarda, Education Policy Analyst. Elizabeth Brown, Supervising Analyst for Housing, Environment, and Infrastructure.
George Switting, Deputy Director.
Sarita Subramanian, I'm Supervising Analyst for the Education Team.
And Paul Lopato, I'm the Supervising Analyst for Social and Community Services.
Great. So we have a lot on the agenda this morning, so we're going to try to keep time. So the first thing I'm going to ask for is a motion to approve the minutes of the last board meeting.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Ronnie.
Aha, okay. I'm going to keep this short. First thing I want to do is introduce Taina, who we just met, who's an education analyst here with a specialization in a focus in visual presentations. Is that?
Yep, and data visualization.
Welcome. Instead of going through a litany of what we've been doing lately, I just wanted to highlight one major thing, which is that we recently testified before the Charter Revision Commission. We, being Georgian person, based upon a lot of materials that we've all worked on, but Lisa has spearheaded. Tony testified on the next panel. I got to watch it on TV because I had no voice, which was great. So we recently testified. As I think all of you know, IBO avoids making policy recommendations, but for this we made an exception. We do make recommendations where issues of budget transparency or budget process were involved, and so we wrote a letter to the Charter Revision Commission with outlining some broad recommendations and then testified. There were three basic areas that we testified in. The first one we highlighted was on budget transparency, and the basic issue is that the city's operating budget is far from transparent, and its capital budget is not transparent at all. So our first recommendation was to restructure the operating budget to make it more transparent. For those of you who've dealt with the city's budget, you know that agency budgets are divided into what's called units of appropriation. And in theory, the charter requires those units of appropriation to be programs, things that the city does. At least in theory, that's what the charter requires. In practice, that doesn't happen because there are far too few units of appropriation to allow those U of A's, as they're called, to be associated with programs. So to take an extreme example, the Department of Homeless Services, which is an agency that spends over $2 billion a year, has only 2 units of appropriation, one of which is personnel, and the other of which is everything else. So, if you're looking to get some handle on, what are they spending on rental assistance or family shelter intake, you're out of luck. So it makes it really difficult for the council and places like IBO and advocates and the general public to get some handle on what the city is spending on programs. And equally important, to be able to link that programmatic spending to performance. Because ultimately that's what you want to do. At least if you're sitting where we're sitting, that's what you want to do. So given that the city doesn't do that, even though the charter technically requires it, we proposed a middle ground, which is based on what OMB calls their budget function analysis. The budget function analysis actually started here, particularly with Preston Niblack and Frank Basilico, who pushed for this, and we pushed our analysts to find ways to break down those agency budgets into programs. Not exactly programs, they're bigger than programs, but something that more closely approximates programs. We pushed it, then the council started pushing it, then OMB developed 15, I believe, different budget function analyses for 15 separate agencies. Never went beyond that. And importantly, never used those budget function analysis in their administration of the budget. Whoa.
Sorry.
Good morning. So they're just sitting there as academic exercises on the OMB website. I guess we use them, but not a lot of other use gets made of them. And so the proposal was to require the city to actually do the budget function analysis for every agency, and importantly, to start administering the budget on that basis, which would make, we believe, the council's oversight of the administration far more fruitful, and make the budget more transparent for everybody. So that's the first part of the recommendation. The second, looking to the capital budget, which is a lot more opaque than the city's operating budget. When a capital project gets delayed, or the scope of the capital project changes, or the project experiences cost overruns, if you use the city's capital budget documents or planning documents, they're absolutely useless. There's no way to track down what happened, or even what the current status of a project is. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and we're not even sure that this is necessarily needs to be within the city charter, but we suggested as a first step that the city look to a new innovation in the Parks Department, which they call their online Parks Capital Tracker, to serve as a starting point for designing a system. But if you go online and look at the Parks Capital Tracker, it shows the location of the capital project, the phase that the project's in, the funding, current timelines, and it gives you a sense of what's going on that you really can't find by going to the documents alone. Okay, the next recommendation was on rainy day funds, which I think there's general agreement that the charter's requirement that the city follow generally accepted accounting practices precludes the establishment of a true rainy day fund for the city. And even if the charter were to be amended, because that requirement to eliminate the gap requirement, because the requirements in the covenants of many bonds that are out there, it would still, those bond covenants would likely prevent us from adopting gap, even if it was in the charter for a number of years. For those of you who've watched this stuff, to some extent, the city's retiree health benefits trust fund, which was established under the Bloomberg administration to start socking some money away for retiree health benefits, acts as an ersatz rainy day fund for the city. But unlike a true rainy day fund, there are no restrictions on when you can take money out of the Retiree Health Benefits Trust. It's got about $4.5 billion in it at the moment. So it's a tempting target, but an administration and council wouldn't have to wait until times were bad to start drawing it down. And conversely, there are no requirements for putting monies into the fund when times are good. So the idea here was to have the city start moving towards the fiscal discipline that a rainy day fund would require by adopting measures that would require some sort of trigger before you can take money out of the benefits fund, and restrictions on, adopting requirements for growing the fund when times are good, that's a better way to put it, and restrictions on when you can take money out of it. And so that was the second large area of recommendations. And the third was just simply access to information from non-mayoral agencies. IBO's access to mayoral agencies is quite good, but that's not the case for places like health and hospitals, or the city's housing authority, or the Economic Development Corporation. These are essential parts of city government. The ability of elected officials other than the mayor to tap that information is very, very limited. And there should be some way for them to do so. So we would support proposals to amend the charter to guarantee broader access to information from city-affiliated agencies. So that was the series of recommendations. All of this is, I don't know what they're going to come out with, but budget's certainly one of their focuses. And whatever they come out with will be on the ballot in November.
So just a point of information, GAP prevents the city from having a rainy day fund?
Yeah, because you're supposed to be spending in any year what you're taking in that year.
Current expenses.
So it's city, it's public entity GAP, it's not,
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Okay.
governmental gap.
yeah.
Gap for governments.
Yes. You came in a little tardy. so
Just
I
the two
wanted
people
you to
that came
introduce
in.
yourself.
Matthew Washington, Deputy Lieutenant Borough President.
Thank you.
Carolina Gill, Queensborough President's Office.
Thank you.
Okay, and the last thing to say, I guess, is that 3 weeks ago we released our overview of the mayor's preliminary budget and financial plan. And since then, we've published a series of 2-pagers, which hopefully you've been getting in your inbox. And we'll be hearing 2 of them today. And that's it.
Does anyone have any questions for him?
Okay.
Okay. All right, so we have 3 different presentations that we're going to try to get to today. And the first, Sarita, is on specialized high schools.
I'm happy we're doing the least politicized one.
Yeah,
And I should say that this is Sarita's publication, but also a broader project of the education team as a whole.
Yes.
It has to be done by 10, is that right?
I'll talk really fast. So good morning. Today I'm going to present a report that we published about 2 months ago on the simulations of the mayor's and chancellor's proposed changes to admissions to the specialized high schools. We looked at what the proposal would mean in terms of the students that would receive offers. We also looked at the middle schools that those students came from, and finally what high schools those students actually attended last year. So what we found was that there would be substantially greater racial diversity among the students who would receive offers. The distribution of offers to students from different public middle schools would be much less concentrated than under the current system. And finally, among the students who would receive offers, Black or Hispanic students were less likely than white or Asian students to actually attend an academically rigorous high school in the city. So to give you a little bit of a quick summary of the proposed changes, last June the mayor and chancellor proposed phasing out the specialized high school admissions test, the SHSAT, as the single means of admissions to the specialized high schools over 2 years. Instead, they propose distributing offers to top students attending each public middle school in the city. And they would create a new composite academic score based on 3 different metrics. The first is state test scores on both English language arts and math. That would comprise 45% of the composite score. And the last metric are grades, and that would comprise 55% of the composite score. So we looked at what offers to incoming 9th graders last year, 2017-18 school year, would have been if the mayor's plan was fully phased in. One important thing to note is that we did not simulate choice because we do not know what this policy would do in terms of student choice, how that would change. So that has a couple of implications. The first of which is that we modeled offers to the specialized high schools collectively, all 8 together, because we don't know what students would choose among them. And that is also something that the Department of Education has done in their own simulations. They do plan to take choice into account if the policy is implemented. And secondly, choice is important because the policy is driven towards affecting the offers that are distributed to students, but ultimately what the composition of students at the specialized high schools depends on is whether or not students choose to accept that offer. From what we've looked at, roughly 18% of students who received an offer last year didn't actually choose to attend a specialized high school, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. And finally, our methodology follows what was proposed in state legislation last year. So how would offers be distributed when the mayor's plan is fully phased in? So it would be implemented in 2 stages. The first stage would distribute offers to the top 7% of students in each public middle school by the composite score. In addition, the city implemented a floor, so all students who would receive an offer also have to meet the criteria of being in the top quarter across the city. So when we looked at this screen filters out very few students in actuality. In the second stage, for any remaining offers, they would be distributed in a random lottery of students with an average of 93 or greater. And it's only in this stage that private school students, for example, or students who attend other public schools other than traditional public and charter schools would be able to receive an offer. So first I'll go over the changes in the demographics and performance of incoming students. So this table shows, the first 2 rows show actual enrollment citywide, and then also students who actually attended the specialized high schools last year. From the first column, you can see that total offers to specialized high schools were roughly just over 5,000. The next set of columns gives you the demographic breakdown by ethnicity. And finally, we looked at the share of students who were female and in poverty. So looking at actual enrollment, you could see, as we know, that the demographic composition of specialized high schools is very different from citywide. Much smaller shares of Black and Hispanic students. Yeah.
The citywide numbers, are those only kids in public school at some point?
Yeah, so these are 9th grade. So that's a good point. So this is only 9th grade because we're looking at offers to 9th graders. So this is the population of 9th graders who attended public schools.
But those are middle schools.
This is for the 17-18 school year.
So what I'm wondering.
They're 9th graders in public schools.
So what I'm wondering about is families who put their kids in a private middle school,
yes,
hoping they would get into
right,
the specialized high schools.
Right.
I would imagine that would dampen the number of white kids.
That is true. Yeah, so that's a good point. We can only, so the private school students in our numbers are only those who we eventually see enter the system.
Okay. So just to give us context, how many kids take the test?
Is it
20,000?
I'm forgetting the actual number, I'm not sure.
So do you know what share of those are non-public school kids?
That I do not know. I can get back to you on that.
Because that would, because if it's 5% of the 20,000, it won't matter much. If it's 30%,
Yeah.
it's going to matter a lot.
Right.
I'll get back to you on that. Okay, so as I mentioned, the share of Black and Hispanic students who actually attended these schools is much smaller than the shares citywide. On the other hand, the share of Asian students who attended the specialized high schools, 61% is much greater than the 15% that are Asian citywide. And similarly for white students. Now turning to the last column, so this is modeling the mayor's plan when fully phased in and comparing it with the population of students who actually attended specialized high schools. We could see that more Black and Hispanic students would get offers. So the share of Black students who would receive offers would be 5 times as much as the share that attended specialized high schools. The share of Hispanic students would be 27%. That's more than 4 times the share that actually attended specialized high schools. And the share of Asian students would decrease by about half to 31% of offers. The share of offers to white students remains roughly the same.
Sarita, you have the percentages of students by ethnicity that attend citywide schools.
Yes.
Do you have the percentages of students by ethnicity who take the exam?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but I can look at that.
We almost certainly don't have that for the private school kids.
Right, yes.
Right.
I'm just wondering about the policy.
Yeah.
They don't have to put it demographically when they take the test.
I'm sorry? What was the question?
Is there a demographic column when they do the test, when they take the SAT?
I don't know. We don't. It's not in our data set.
We do it by matching to
We do it by
to the student file itself.
right to enrollment numbers. Excuse me. Interestingly, we also found that the share of offers to female students would increase pretty substantially compared to the current system. So they would comprise a majority of offers under the top 7% scenario.
So under the new program,
Yes.
the children or their parents would be passive in some sense.
Right.
Whereas now you have to apply. You have to take the test and you
Yes.
have to apply.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's something we talked about in the brief, that the part of the benefit of using New York State standardized tests and grades is that it's available for all students as opposed to opting into the specialized high school exam. And finally, the share of students in poverty would increase as well.
Sarita, can you just, is there some hypothesis, some explanation for why the number of women would go up so much?
Yeah, so some other research has shown that female students are less likely to even sit for the specialized high school exam. There is some research. Oh.
Is that empirically verified, or is it?
It's something that the Research Alliance has looked at. So yeah, they did a study looking at that. There have been some research about because grades are factored more heavily in this composite score, that female students tend to have higher grades, and so therefore that probably also is a likely contributor. Okay. So we also looked at the incoming student achievement profile for students who would receive offers. So when the policy was proposed, some people raised concerns about the proposal leading to some students who would be admitted to the specialized high schools that would not be academically prepared for the rigorous instruction and curriculum. So we looked at the 3 metrics that go into the composite score to see how that would look under the citywide population, the actual specialized high schools, and then finally our top 7% scenario. So we found that when looking at grades, the first column, you could see that grades actually increased slightly if the mayor's plan was fully in place. In terms of the proficiency rate on the English language arts exam, we see a very slight decline and a larger decline for the math proficiency rate. So we also, as I mentioned, looked at
Proficiency rate was level 3 or 4?
Correct, yes. We also, in the report, we break down by level 3 versus 4. We also looked at what middle school students would come from. Part of the reason that the policy was meant to distribute offers more evenly across middle schools was because of the concentration of offers to particular middle schools under the current system. So for example, one middle school had 268 students who received an offer out of the total of 5,000 across the city. So we looked at how that would differ under the proposal. How many different middle schools would students have come from? And also, are there variations by the type of middle school that they attended, traditional public, charter, or private? And this chart shows you that the offers to the specialized high schools would be more evenly distributed to students across different middle schools. So here the horizontal axis is the cumulative share of middle schools with students receiving offers, and the vertical axis is the cumulative share of all offers to the specialized high schools. So both axes sum up to 100%.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So kids have choices for middle schools too, right?
That's correct.
Some distance.
Some choice.
Right.
And you're assuming that the distribution of kids to middle schools is not going to change if they change the high school admissions policy. But I'm guessing it'll change a lot.
Right. So we are not assuming anything. Obviously. We're taking the city's assumption. So I do think that has been part of the debate, in that this policy could definitely have implications for the lower levels of schooling, like
I
middle
can tell you
school.
that around the lunch table at my office, it would have really big implications.
Yeah. I would also like to highlight that these are 8 schools, so out of 500 high schools citywide. So in discussion, we talked about this with the Department of Education, and because other schools also use these same criteria, some screen schools, to admit students, the Department of Education thinks it's unlikely for students to, quote unquote, put all their eggs in one basket.
In what sense?
In the sense of, if I think I have a better chance of getting in because I go to a lower performing school, if I don't get into the specialized high schools, then that could have implications, more broadly.
So I believe, but I could be completely wrong, that there's research that indicates that when you put high-performing kids in a school with lower-performing kids, and the lower-performing kids do better.
Right, yes.
And so moving all those kids around into more middle schools could just lift the entire
Right.
seed.
I mean, I do think that that's an unspoken hopeful effect of the policy.
Okay.
So if offers were equally distributed across all schools, we would expect the distribution to look like this 45-degree line, where, for example, 80% of offers are distributed to 80% of middle schools, or students in 80% of middle schools. The current system, the thick black line, shows how concentrated the current system is, where 80% of offers are given to students attending 20% of middle schools. Under the proposal, the purple line, which is closer to the 45-degree line, we see that offers would be more evenly distributed compared to the current system. But still 80% of offers are distributed to about 50% of middle schools, students at 50% of middle schools.
Some of those middle schools you're talking about where there's concentrations of students, like you mentioned, a school with 200,
Yes.
those are screened middle schools.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That, so it's not necessarily, this random sample that has all these great kids in one school, high-performing children in one school. They're screened on the way in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that while your theory may be correct that it would cause some spreading out, it'll also cause some kids to leave the public school system. So, you have...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely could be, and you'll see in the next
Right,
slide.
You might get them from different middle schools, but it might be the same kids.
Right. Well,
That
you're
could
going to get some of
definitely-
that, and then, right, exactly.
That could happen as well. Yeah. So in terms of the total number of different middle schools with students receiving offers under the current system, it's 509 middle schools. And under the proposal, it would increase to 691 middle schools, an increase of 182 schools, which is a 35% increase.
We don't even have 691 middle schools.
This includes, good question. So this includes, yeah, so this includes traditional public, charter, and
Okay.
private schools. Excellent question. I was testing to make
As you
sure.
said, that's a
you
pretty
were
good
paying
number.
But that was a good segue, focusing on just the traditional public schools, the number of traditional public middle schools with students receiving at least one offer would double from 243 under the current system up to 488, so virtually all traditional public middle schools.
Right now, 20 middle schools send 50% of the kids
Right.
to specialized high schools.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
You could tell by how steep this curve
Yeah.
is.
And how many of those schools have an entry barrier of their own?
I don't know.
Probably most.
Probably a
Most.
lot.
Most. Most.
Really?
Yeah.
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 I had no idea.
So to get at your question a little bit, Mark, while I just mentioned that the number of traditional public schools, different public middle schools that would be represented would increase, when we looked at the sector as a whole, we saw more modest increases in the share of offers to students from traditional public middle schools. So in this chart, the vertical axis is the percent of offers to specialized high schools, so 5,000. And the in each bar shows the current system and then the mayor's proposal. So looking at the blue bars, the share of offers to traditional public middle schools, we can see that that ticks up a little bit, not as much as the increase in the different number of middle schools that are represented. Looking at the red bars, you can see that the share of offers to charter school students would increase more strongly. And finally, the share of offers to private school students would decline substantially under the mayor's proposal, because recall they only receive offers in the second stage after they're distributed to traditional public and charter middle schools.
So how many more kids would be in the middle schools if parents stopped taking their kids out of the public school system
Yeah,
to preserve their shot at the specialized high schools?
yeah. This is a simulation based on.
No, I know
Yeah,
that, but I mean, I don't have a sense of scale, and so I don't know how many, 10% there. How many kids is that?
So it's 10% of the 5,000
So
offers.
it's 500. It's only
Yeah,
500
right,
kids.
exactly.
Okay.
But I didn't show you the numbers. We do have them in the paper. But the number of different private middle schools that would receive an offer would drop significantly. So finally, the last portion of the analysis looked at where did students who would receive offers actually attend high schools last year. And this final section is really meant to give some observation of the choices that students make, given the choices that were available at the time last year, in the absence of this proposal. And we wanted to see, in particular, are there other high schools that students avail of course, because these are only 8 high schools that we're talking about. And what are the academic profile of those high schools? How rigorous are they academically? And how does it vary by student ethnicity? Are certain groups of students attending different types of high schools? So first, I'll just quickly go over the how we characterize the academic performance of all traditional public and charter high schools. So we used the share of students that graduated college ready in both English and math, and this is a Department of Education metric. They take into account the type of diploma that students receive, Regents or Advanced Regents, which has greater requirements, and also performance on the English Language Arts and Math Regents exams, as well as AP test taking. So this chart shows the results by the ethnicity of students. So each of these bars represents the students who would receive offers under the mayor's proposal, and within each group it sums up to 100% of students who would receive offers. Drawing your attention to the different colors, that shows how we grouped high schools. So purple represents specialized high schools with a college ready rate at 97% or greater. Green bars represents other high schools with a college ready rate of 97 or greater. And then the red bars represent schools with a college ready rate of 63 to 97%. 63% represents the minimum among the top quarter of city high schools. And finally, those with a below 63% college ready rate. So focusing on the purple and green bars, which I'll consider, which I'll call academically rigorous schools, they have a college ready rate of 97% or greater. We could see that the share of Black and Hispanic students who actually attended an academically rigorous school is just 12 to 16%, so much smaller shares, compared with Asian and white students, where 63% and 46% respectively attended academically rigorous high schools.
How many schools are represented in the green bar?
That is a good question. Let me get back to you on that, I'm not sure.
And how many of...
Just to underline a point Sarita made, this is the distribution of students who would have received offers in our simulation. It's not
Right.
all students, it's just students who...
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
And how many of the green bars are screened schools?
Okay.
Because there's other screened high schools.
Yes,
Not
that
just
is true, yes.
Screen programs.
The screen programs or other screens and that.
I will get back to you on those questions. But since we're talking about the green bars, I did also want to note that they are larger among Asian and white students. So even those students are availing of these other high schools with very similar high college ready rates. So I'll fast forward to essentially the past 2 weeks. They've been very active. Last week, to say the least. Last week, offers to next year's 9th graders were sent out, and I'm sure we've all read the news about the small numbers of Black and Hispanic students who have received offers, especially at Stuyvesant. And it's important to note that we largely expect the total number of offers to Black and Hispanic students to increase because this is also the first time that the Discovery Program was expanded. The Discovery Program is another component of the mayor's policy that is meant to, that doesn't require state legislation for them to implement. It's a program that already exists to provide extra support to students over the summer who just miss the cutoff for the SH-SAT. And it provides extra supports. The mayor is proposing to target this expansion of the program to students from high poverty middle schools. So that's why we expect the total number of Black and Hispanic students who receive offers to increase. But that also meant that 300 offers to the specialized high schools in this round were withheld. So fewer offers went out, roughly 4,800. The State Assembly and Senate have both announced that they'll be holding hearings and community forums beginning in April. And others are calling for more specialized high school seats, addressing segregation at earlier stages of the system. We've talked about screens in middle schools, expanding gifted and talented programs even in elementary school. And finally, also generally incorporating multiple metrics for admissions to the specialized high schools. So, if any
Did your
other
simulations
questions?
incorporate Discovery?
No, we did not, because if we did the simulations based on if the mayor's plan was fully phased in, and they plan to eliminate Discovery.
Oh, yeah.
Because Discovery is meant to be an intermediate step.
So I'm trying to remember in the report,
I have it
whether
here.
or
if
not
you'd
we
like.
looked at issues of poverty, immigration status, and other variables in addition to race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did look at poverty. We didn't look at immigration status. We could. We do have that information.
So my guess is there's some relationship between those and some of the other variables we look at.
Mm-hmm.
The second question I ask is, we've had this structure in place. The test has changed modestly over the years, but the structure's been in place in
Right.
3 schools ever since the bill passed.
Yes.
The percentage of admitted kids of color at some of those schools has deteriorated dramatically over that period.
Right.
Tech used to be 10, 12% African American, now
Yeah.
it's not. So have we tried to unpack why that happened? If the methodology is the same, the city's racial mix changed modestly, not dramatically, why the percentages have dropped so much in those schools?
Yeah, it's not something we've looked at specifically, and it's definitely something that is being talked about a lot more now. Jamani Williams talked about it in his op-ed yesterday. So, I do think a lot of people are pointing to the larger system and trying to understand. The Department of Education has made greater efforts to increase test taking among Black and Hispanic students, but to your point, yes, they're still not passing the test at the same rates as they used to historically.
Right. Something's changed.
Yes.
Either fewer are taking it, or fewer are passing it.
Right.
Or the overall performance by other groups has gone up. Something in the
Right,
arithmetic
yes.
has to have changed.
Right.
It's not really a passing issue, it's a ranking issue, right?
Correct.
And so if some groups are, for example, taking test prep
Yeah,
at greater rates than others, those groups, the test prep takers are probably gonna do better.
Right.
And we don't offer free test prep to all of our students.
Right. There is a DREAM program that does target students in, I believe, beginning in 6th grade, if I'm not mistaken. It's unclear how that's really impacted passing rates.
Are they developing the current system with the yield? In other words, if someone receives an offer, what percentage of them take it?
So we did find that 18% do not take it.
Okay.
So.
Just to your question, I don't know if there's a difference in yield, but it could be another factor.
Could be, right.
On the current criteria for grades, is that overall GPA? What is that?
Yes,
How's
that's a
that
good
measured?
question. It's an average of their 4 core course grades, so on the scale of 0 to 100.
And is that publicly available? Can people know across schools?
No.
Variations in that?
And actually, it's on their high school application data set, and it wasn't even on our data set. So it wasn't until we started asking about doing these simulations that we were then given that data. So it's not publicly available.
Now, there are schools, several of them, that if a child is in a rigorous track in middle school, they weight their grades. And then there are other schools that have similarly rigorous tracks that do not weight their grades. That was just raw data, correct, that you looked at?
Yes. Yes, and how the department used it was simple, a simple average.
Right.
Yes, straight average.
So some of that data may be due to certain schools with weights and not others. Because the score that the department gets is the weighted score.
That could be.
Right.
Yes. And actually, this issue of weighting is something we're looking at more largely, also at the high school level.
Do you know where the kids who don't take the offers go, the 18%?
We could look at that, for sure.
My guess is at least some of them are private school kids who took the test just to see, and private school still has some
Didn't get their
attraction.
option.
Right.
We also have a significant
Yeah.
number of students that have pretty rigorous programs at their local high school, and also perhaps a sports team that they're interested in, or something else, some other reason, or they don't want to travel. So I've seen a significant number of students turn down the specialized school to go to another pretty rigorous program within the.
That's good.
Yeah, and we are working on an analysis looking at, actually Tina is working on that, on where top scoring middle school students do attend high schools, and there are other ones. Not surprisingly, that's a punchline. And one interesting thing, which I think why the charter school finding here is really interesting, is that a lot of students in the charter sector do tend to go to the charter high school that's in the part of the network affiliation, for example. And then, you know, in Queens in particular, like Townsend Harris and other, you know, there are other very selective high schools that students are attending.
In fact, since the application process is parallel,
Yes.
meaning you rank among all the non-specialized schools, and then you take the specialized school test and rank among that,
Right.
you could probably do, if they would give you the data, some correlation as to how many kids got their first or second choice in the rank,
Right.
and then may have opted not to take their third or fourth choice on the specialized high
Right.
school exam.
Right.
Yes.
So that relationship would be interesting to see,
Yeah.
in addition to the private
So they
schools.
rank them separately?
They do, yeah,
So
it's
separate
two,
process.
yeah,
Okay.
right.
So I think thank you.
Yes.
Timeliness.
Yes.
We could spend all day debating this. So Elizabeth is going to present on the funds needed to meet the terms of the housing authority's settlement and whether or not they're sufficient.
Did you read this brief? So good morning. I'm going to talk about a brief we released as part of our preliminary budget series. It is examining a settlement that the city recently signed along with the New York City Housing Authority and the federal government that settled some litigation and requires the Housing Authority to make major improvements and repairs in NYCHA, which is the Housing Authority. And as part of the settlement, the city is required to put in a substantial amount of funds, and we wanted to see, you know, is that enough? So just a little background, I'm sure we all know what NYCHA is. Here I call it the beleaguered housing authority because if you were to do a Google News search, beleaguered is the most common adjective for NYCHA or housing authority. But it is home to 400,000 New Yorkers in 176,000 apartments. It is the federal housing authority. It is funded by the federal government. Well, I should say it's chronically underfunded by the federal government, both on the operating and capital side. So it does not get the money it needs from Washington to fully operate or meet its capital needs. And one way to see that is this summer, the Housing Authority released a physical needs assessment. So how much money would it take to bring NYCHA up to a state of good repair over the next 5 years? And that totals $32 billion. I will say that I have not independently verified this $32 billion. NYCHA paid for consultants to do this, but it is the number that we have and has been widely used. It was done by development, so just a little disclaimer there. And if you've been watching the news, you know that things aren't going well at NYCHA, really overall. Tenants have been exposed to lead. There was a big scandal that NYCHA had been not inspecting for lead, although they said they were for many years. There's problems with mold, heat outages, elevator outages, pests, so pretty much anything you don't want in your housing is going on at the Housing Authority. So all this resulted this summer in a complaint filed by the federal government in the Southern District of New York saying that NYCHA has failed to provide safe and sanitary housing. On the same day this complaint was filed, a consent decree was signed. That's the way this works. This sort of settled the litigation. It answered the complaint. NYCHA admitted fault, and there were remedies outlined in the consent decree. I will highlight a few. A federal monitor was established, so this is someone who would come in and oversee a bunch of changes at the Housing Authority. What we were most interested in, the city was required to put in $4.2 billion to fund some of these capital improvements. $2 billion were already in the city's capital commitment plan, so this required they spend that and also an additional $2.2 billion over 10 years. There were no new federal funds required in the consent decree, despite the fact that this is the Federal Housing Authority. And so a consent decree, and Lisa can give us a probably better definition of consent decrees, but these are judicially managed, and they have to be approved in court. And this one was not approved, which is actually, I think, fairly rare. So in November, a federal judge rejected the consent decree, basically saying in 52 pages that it was too vague. There was not enough specificity in what NYCHA would need to do to remedy the problems outlined in the complaint, and also what, if they don't meet these requirements, what would happen to NYCHA. So the judge rejected it and said they could move forward with a new revised consent decree. What was talked a lot in the press, that NYCHA would go into federal receivership, federal government would take it over, or in some other way. And so the result was actually some other way. In January, the city, the Housing Authority, and the federal government signed a settlement agreement, which is different than a consent decree in that it does not have to be, it's not judicially managed, and it does not have to be approved in the same way. Many things were the same though. Federal monitor, still established. $4.2 billion in city capital, still required. No new federal funds, but this time there were some performance deadlines, performance goals and deadlines actually outlined, which is one of the things the judge didn't like about the first one. And these were in 5 main areas: lead paint, elevator outages, heat allergies, mold, and pests. And I'm going to go through what some of these goals look like. They're interesting. And then powers of the monitor. So there's been some debate about how powerful this monitor is, and I am not going to tell you one way or the other, but it did outline some powers. The monitor can allocate and reallocate resources and staff. It can hire contractors. So there were some specifics about what the monitor could and could not do. So now we have a settlement agreement. We know the city is on the hook for a fair amount of funds. Is it enough? Is the city going to be asked for more? Does NYCHA have other funds to pay for the goals that are outlined? So the first thing we had to do is figure out how much does this settlement agreement cost. Sorry, we don't know. So the short answer is I can't give you an answer right now. Maybe if we get that more information through the city charter. But short answer, we don't know. The way the goals are outlined in the settlement agreement you'll see in a minute, but it's really hard to use them to get an estimate. The Housing Authority will have to put together a much more specific action plan, and actually probably soon. Be coming out with that has to be approved by the federal monitor, and maybe that will provide more detail, but at this point we're not exactly sure. And the Housing Authority has also said they don't know. One of the main areas where they have to make improvements is in regard to abating lead paint, and you'll probably all know this from the news too, they don't know how much lead paint there is in NYCHA right now, so they're going around testing it. Once they know how much there is altogether, they actually have to abate the lead paint, which is different than remediating lead paint. So instead of painting over, peeling paint, they actually eventually have to remove all lead paint from NYCHA. And that, they say they also don't know how much that's going to cost, because really that's very rarely done, usually remediate lead paint. But anyway, so that was a long, short answer for we don't know. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there was a physical needs assessment done. And so it can provide some clues. can't answer the question, but we can get an idea. So there are 5 areas of improvements needed at NYCHA, and I'm going to start with one of them, but we can take some information out of the physical needs assessment. So elevators. To give you a sense of what riding in an elevator at NYCHA is like right now, according to the complaint filed by the federal government in 2016, on average, well, there was an average of more than 13 outages per elevator at NYCHA developments. So that's a current state. In the agreement, and I'm going to read this, it's complicated. In 5 years, 85% of elevators in all buildings shall have an unplanned outage no more than 8 times per year, and no single elevator should have an unplanned outage more than 12 times a year. So specific on the number of outages that are allowed to meet this requirement, non-specific on duration of outages, frequency with one elevator, for example. Yes?
Is there any data on what a private building, what type of outages they, like?
Yeah, no, not that I know of, but I can judge by this office building. And I would say we're getting close to NYCHA, and there has been no consent decree issued. I mean, I feel like they're fairly common, but 13 per year. And there's also another sort of milestone that I didn't put here, and I haven't committed to memory, but for buildings that only have one elevator, the standard is higher. Right. So it also does. There is some language about depending on how many elevators you have.
But I'd also check. I think that standard is higher than is required in the New York City building code.
Of what?
Of private New York City building code.
Check
Which
it.
means
Yeah.
it is possible that the city signed an agreement mandating a higher standard on NYCHA than is required of privately owned.
I would not be surprised, because what I mentioned before about abating and remediating lead paint, I mean, that is a higher standard than is required by the New York City housing code. Private landlords are not required to abate lead paint. So that seems right in line with how this agreement is going. So we can take the physical needs assessment and we can break out what the total cost to bring all elevators into a state of good repair, which theoretically you're probably going to have to do a lot of that work to get to 8 times a year. And that would be $1.5 billion over 5 years. So luckily the goal was over 5 years and our money's over 5 years, so that just worked out well for us. Another example, heat. Again, I'm going to give you in the complaint, what's it like at NYCHA with heat. Last year, during last heat season, the average heat outage lasted 48 hours. Now I will say NYCHA has announced this year they're doing much, much better. The average heat outage is down to 10 hours, so I'm pretty impressed by that. I'm not exactly sure how you get to 48 to 10 hours within a year, especially when you need, according to the physical needs assessment, 744 boilers, but either something was really going wrong last year and they fixed that. That is some good news. In the agreement, they are required in 5 years for 85% of heating shortfalls. NYCHA will store heat within 12 hours and in no event more than 24 hours. And that's close to the city standard. So if you have certain degrees during the winter, the landlord must fix your heat or the city will come and do it.
But there's no agreement on how often the heat can go out for 10 hours at a time.
Again, yeah. So
so every night would be acceptable.
I talked about these as once being vague and specific at the same time. So, there's these parts of it are very specific, and then other parts are completely open-ended. There are more of these sort of types of goals in the agreement, but they all address the same type of indicator. So yes. So again, with that in mind, we don't know exactly how much it will cost to get this 12 hours, 24 and 85%, but we do know that, according to the NYCHA's physical needs assessment, in order to get the whole heating plant just to a state of good repair, it would cost $2.5 billion over the next 5 years. So we add, simple math here, 2.5 plus 1.5 equals $4 billion over the next 5 years, and that's just for the heat need and the elevator need. We still haven't gotten into mold, which is a huge capital need for roof repairs. Lead, which I mentioned, they're going to have to abate, so that's a capital cost, and then pests, which, so it seems like it will be expensive. So how much money does NYCHA have? This is NYCHA's 5-year, the funding for NYCHA's 5-year capital plan. So I'll draw your attention first to the bottom. So this, over the next 5 years, they have $6.4 billion currently in their capital plan. The greatest source of funds is the city, 2.7 over the next 5 years. I talked about 4.2 at the beginning. That's what the city is required to put in over the next 10 years. So 2.7 is required in the next 5 years. This is about, I think, 1.2 billion is part of the new money that was added in the settlement. The rest had previously been there. But the money, even the money that had previously been there, is a huge increase over what the city usually, in recent years, has provided to the Housing Authority for capital repairs. I think around 6 times, if you looked at the previous 5 years. Second greatest contributor here is the federal government. This is the federal capital grant that goes to any public housing authority. It's part of their funding, and that's 2.1 billion. Again, this didn't reflect anything new because of the settlement. It's just what they are expected to get as a formula, basically, each year. We have 450 million coming from the state. This, however, is money they promised last year and never provided. So the governor has said that he will provide the funds as needed. I think that's the quote, as needed or as requested by the federal monitor. So they put it in their capital budget. We'll keep it there. There's 825 million, and this is sort of leftover money they're still spending for Sandy repairs. That's disaster recovery, and then they have some other funding sources, 301. So we have 6.4 billion to fund. What we saw at the beginning was a $32 billion need over 5 years. These are all over 5 years, and when we looked at the heat and elevator need, that was at least $4 billion, which is 60% of this. So there seems to be we might need some more money. And I will say that in the money that's the 6.4 billion, there's other things. I mean, there have been priorities that have been sort of, not talked about as much right now, but replacing facades, playgrounds, a lot of money in the budget for security, putting video cameras, and so it's not just those 5 areas either. Now, will the city and NYCHA move all those funds to those 5 areas? We'll keep an eye on that.
Were
So,
community facilities part of that?
yeah, community, a bunch of the city money, especially this 1.2 that's in 2019. So I don't know if you've been following it. NYCHA sort of gets in trouble for not committing the city funds fast enough, and a lot of those funds are for security and more like the community facilities, playgrounds, basketball courts. I mean, there is a lot of money for boilers as well, but not everything is for boilers or for roof repair. So who will cover this potential shortfall? We have some options here. The first I put is NYCHA itself. So NYCHA released a new fundraising plan, sort of, at the end of last year called NYCHA 2.0 that would raise funds in 3 ways. The first would be selling transferable development rights, raising funds that way, and that would bring in potentially $1 billion over 10 years. So we're moving to 10 years now. Building some market rate and mixed rate housing on NYCHA land, which is not particularly popular in the past, but facing tough times here. That would bring in, as it's estimated to bring in by NYCHA, $2 billion over the next 10 years. And then the biggest source of funds is actually not really raising funds, but moving NYCHA apartments off the public housing balance and moving them to Section 8. And that would reduce the capital need that NYCHA faces because they would move these projects to Section 8, which is another federal housing program that's been historically better funded, but more importantly allows for some private funds to be used in making repairs. So the plan is over the next 10 years to move 62,000 apartments from NYCHA to this Section 8 program, and that would reduce the capital need by, I believe, a little bit less than $13 billion. So if you add up, but I'm dividing it in half because everything else is in 5 years, you would still need $18 billion to reach the $32 billion capital need. So even if all that is very successful, it seems to me other funds will be necessary. And not just me, NYCHA has also said it, so it's not breaking news. So who will provide it? The city, potentially. I think some would argue has the most to lose if they do not meet the terms of this agreement. The mayor has been very consistent in his view that he wants more local, to keep local control over the housing authority and does not want to see it go into federal receivership. And they are currently providing the most funding in their 5-year capital plan. The state has yet to provide the money it promised last year, so maybe. And the federal government has consistently underfunded as well and has not provided any new money despite outlining very, very specifically the problems in NYCHA.
I believe the president's budget this year zeroed out all capital funds.
Yes, so it does seem unlikely if you're choosing D. Maybe reconsider D as a choice, and perhaps E as well. So IBO will be watching. We'll let you know when we figure it out. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
That was very inspirational.
Yeah.
Your presentation.
Inspired you to move out of New York.
I know.
We have another report, but I think we're going to wait for that and go into an executive session now.
And which should be brief, and Paul's presentation is brief, and hopefully this will work out in a way where we can get it all in. Yes. Okay. So we need a motion.
We need a motion to go into executive session.
Motion.
Second.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul.
Are we ready? All right, good.
Thank you.
The governor's executive budget includes a proposal that would add to New York City's increasing share of cash assistance. By cash assistance, we need public assistance or welfare. Specifically, the proposal would require the city to pay 10% of all family assistance costs. Currently, family assistance is paid for with 100% federal funds. Interestingly, the proposal would only apply to New York City. The other localities would all receive 100% federal funding for family assistance.
Paul, can I just have you stand a little closer to the...
The city receives quite a bit of family assistance. In fact, we get about $1.25 billion a year. So that means 10% would be a hit of about $125 million in city costs. And the change would primarily impact two programs. First, cash assistance program in NYCHA, the basic grant program to families, which now budgets about $530 million in family assistance. So 10% of that would cost us $53 million. And also the family shelter system at the Department of Homeland Services, because the city uses the shelter grant portion of family assistance recipients living in the shelters to help pay for the system. And the city currently budgets about $590 million there, so that 10% of that is about $59 million. In addition to that, there's some miscellaneous pieces, including domestic violence and administrative costs. The total comes to $125 million. If enacted, the governor's proposal would add to the city's growing share of cash assistance costs, and it would free up federal block grant funds that the state could then use for its own purposes, usually to replace programs that would otherwise be funded with state money. New York City's share of cash assistance costs has been rising for the last 2 decades, and there are 2 reasons for that. One is basic caseload trends, which I'll get into. A different mix is occurring over time, which leads to different funding. And secondly, state policy decisions, and in particular one big one that was made in 2011 that changes the funding formula for cash assistance. In 1996, we had the big federal welfare law change, and in 1997, the state passed implementing legislation. The federal law did all sorts of things, but for our purposes, the 2 most important things is that A, it turned an open-ended federal funding stream into a block grant called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF block grant. And then B, it set a 5-year limit on families who were receiving that kind of federal assistance. Previously, there had been no time limit. So in anticipation of these changes, the state implementing legislation set up a 3-tiered cash assistance system. First was called family assistance, which is for families with minor children. And this system would be funded 50% with federal funding, 25% state, 25% local. But the federal funding would come out of the block grant. So in theory, you could run out of money. The second system was called safety net, and that applied to families without minor children or single individuals. And that system was to be there was no federal funding for that at all. It was a state system. It was 50% federal, 50% state, 50% city, no federal at all. And in anticipation of the 5-year limit hitting, they set up a 3rd tier, which was 60-month converted. The 60-month converted was basically like the safety net system, except these were families who had been on family assistance and now moved out. And like safety net, this was to be funded 50% state and 50% city. no federal funding. Now, at the beginning, in these early years, the system remained largely a federal system. As late as December 2000, family assistance constituted about 84% of all recipients, and only 16% were safety net. So this was basically a federal system. And then we got to December of 2001, and that was the first month in which the 5-year time limit hit the first cohort of families that had been on. So each month after that, a lot of families were moving off of family assistance and on the 60-month converted. So by the time we got to 2003, when it began to stabilize, this movement between the two systems, family assistance was now down to about 47% of the system. Safety net had risen to about 22%, and 60-month converted, which didn't exist earlier, was now 31% of the system. Now this was bad news right off the bat for the city in terms of funding, because as family assistance was going down, they were only gaining 25% savings. But as the other two systems were going up, it was paying 50%. So this was the first thing that was happening. Now, since that time, caseload trends have continued to hurt the city in terms of its funding share. First, this is what I'm showing you here is the number of recipients on all three systems combined from 2003 to 2018. By 2003, there were about 430,000 individuals in the system. That was way down from its peak in the mid-90s before the Giuliani purges and the federal rules that set in, where it had been like 1.1 million. So it was down it was less than half than what it used to be. In the early Bloomberg years, the caseload continued to decline until you got to 2008, and it went down to about 330,000. And then the Great Recession hit. When that happened, the caseload stopped going down, the job market got much worse. Interestingly enough, it didn't really go up much in response to the added unemployment and the loss of income. And since that point, it's been extremely stable. It's moved between like 335,000 and 375,000. Now that kind of stability, though, has really hidden what's happening within that among the three different systems. And they're moving in very different directions. If you take a look first at the blue line there, that's family assistance. In 2003, there were about 200,000 people on family assistance. It started to come down, and it slowed down because during the recession, but more recently it's begun to go down again. So we're down to about 120,000 people on family assistance. The 60-month converted, there was some original decline, but it's basically been very stable over like the last 10 years. But safety net, in contrast, is going up. And beginning, as of 2003, there were about 85,000 individuals on safety net. It started to go up, and really, except for a little blip there, a statistical blip where they moved people from one system to another, it was sort of an accounting thing. It's been pretty steadily rising, so that by December of 2018, it's up to about 150,000. Now, in terms of shares, there's been a big change, so that in 2003, family assistance was 47% of the total. Now it's down to 34%. Safety net, which had been 21% of the total, is now up to 41%. So it's doubled, basically. Now, this is bad news in terms of cost, once again, because every time somebody leaves family assistance, we save 25%. And every time somebody goes on to safety net assistance, we pay 50%. And this would be bad in and of itself, except that the actual picture is actually worse than this because of what happened here. In 2011, the state legislature passed and the governor signed, it was actually originated by Cuomo, and the state legislature passed it, a change in the funding formulas for all three systems. It said, while family assistance became 100% federal instead of 50%, the other two systems went from 50% city to 71% city. So while the city sort of gained on the family assistance side, this was more than made up for by the change in the other two systems, especially when you consider that family assistance is going down. Every time it goes down, we save nothing now. And safety net's going up. Every time it goes up, we're paying 71% of the cost. So the bottom line here, if we look over the last 20 years, this was the funding breakout for total cash assistance all put together, three systems put together. If you look at 1999, the feds were paying about 40% of the total cost. The city was paying 29%, and the state about 31%. Now, since that time, we've had the 5-year rule hitting, we've had the caseload trends, which have been family assistance going down, safety net going up, and we had this big funding change, so that by the current budget proposed in the preliminary budget proposed for next year, the city's share goes from 29% all the way up to 44%, 15 percentage point gain. The federal share is down slightly, 40 to about 36%, but the big winners were the state. That goes from 31% down to 20%. And to put this in the context of money, the total budget now for cash assistance is about 1.6 billion, so every percentage point is about $16 million. So if you multiply that loss of 15%, or that gain of 15 percentage points comes to about $240 million a year that we're paying, that we would not have been paying had we had the same share we had 20 years ago. Now, on top of that, the governor's proposal would make things worse. Over here, this is what you saw before. Under the current law, as you saw before, we're paying 44%. It would go up to 47%, slightly more than 47%. The feds would go from about 36 to 33, and the state portion would stay the same. So what's the state's motive for doing this? Is that it's freeing up TANF. And what they're going to do is they're going to take TANF, and then you can see this in their TANF plan, and they're going to spend it on things that otherwise would cost them money. And in particular,
upstate counties.
Well, actually, the state itself. And there's in 2014, the federal government reauthorized child care funding. When it did so, it put in all these extensive requirements about health and safety, and the state immediately realized this was going to cost them money. They kept getting waivers, and now they've run out of their waivers. They have to pay this year. They're estimating it's going to cost about $80 million. So instead of putting in state funds, they put in TANF funds. And in order to get the TANF funds, they had to take it from the city, which is basically, so they're just moving funds around. So it's basically, we're taking from the city and we're putting in places that would otherwise cost the state money.
Can I ask a question? Do you have detail on like, these are household pets, right?
Well, the numbers are, you're seeing actual recipients.
Okay.
Right.
Do you have data on working versus non-working? Like, do we know if the individuals receiving some form of cash assistance, if the proportion that are working or still getting cash assistance has changed over time? I'm just curious.
We don't have data. We do have data on how many people are working at various things, but not as a share. My guess is that, well, certainly more people are working, but then a lot of them move off. So I really can't answer that question. What would be unbalanced?
And then I just wondered if there's a way to model the impact of the minimum wage increases, and if we think that might impact these caseloads moving forward.
It isn't showing up, I mean, so far in the overall caseload. I mean, that's been very, very steady. There are things, there's a reason why the family assistance is going down and safety net is going up, and that probably has to do with, if you look at the makeup of the caseload in terms of demographics, it's fewer children, and among the adults it's more male. So I think there's something going on there in terms of the labor market. It probably has to do with the fact that the growth sectors are things like healthcare, which mainly hire women.
Right.
So they're going off of the caseload altogether.
And I have one other question that I should know, but are child-only cases, do child-only cases have a timeline? Can they also only receive TANF for 5 years?
It's a good question. I think that there are child-only cases on the 16-month converted, so they probably do, but I'd have to check that.
They gotta work around.
Yeah. Any other
Did
questions?
you have data on eligibility versus caseload? Because I feel like there's a lot of barriers for people accessing a lot of benefits in the city of New York. So
we don't have data on eligibility. A while back, we got data, this was several years ago, from NYCHA on applicants. And what we find is that, and we looked at the recession that occurred in the beginning of the century, 2001, and the interesting story there was the number of applicants didn't go up that much. So it looks like barriers are deterring people from applying in the first place.
I often thought we should put a line, we used to have a line in the budget for revenue called state aid. The state gave us money. I think we should start putting a line in the budget that's called state aid when we give them money. That should be a new category.
like
Actually,
600 million of it.
Yeah.
It's like tons. They keep doing these cities over a million things.
Yeah.
Every time they do it,
Yep.
we're just supporting their budget.
Make that really transparent in the budget.
Yes.
I do going forward.
For some reason, they actually this year are using, a couple of them are defined as 5 million.
5 million. Cities
Yeah,
over
I
5
don't know
million.
who they're worried about.
They're optimistic about Buffalo.
Buffalo.
so if you're ever revising this presentation for someone else, since we are the city IBO, I would make the city share red and the other shares more contrasted.
Good one.
Blue is too neutral.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. We did our projections and we thought they were going to go up.
Yeah.
And we received criticism for projecting that.
Have you ever done anything looking at foster care, homelessness, and public assistance, like to
No.
look at how those have changed over time? We have this
Not
weird
in a
assumption.
comprehensive way.
Foster care.
Yeah, foster care, family homelessness, and public assistance. There's like something going on. I think, I don't know. I think the reason why people are falling into shelter have to do with other systems no longer capturing them. I don't know
The
that.
family
for
numbers
sure.
have been reasonably steady the last few years. It's actually the singles number that's driving the homeless growth right now,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is, really showing up in there some. But it'd be good to look at the interaction of all
Yeah.
three of these.
So, I think we're done. So I guess I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Wayne, second?
Second.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your train is very
Give a
good.
train, give a train.
Oh,
We'll
yeah.
have a beef
How you
on
doing?
West in Philly.
Good, how are you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the,
Yeah, it's beef on
yeah,